Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast. And for today's interview, I have Primavera De Filipi. She is a legal scholar, internet activist, and artist whose work focuses on the blockchain, peer production, communities, and copyright law. She is one of the earliest and probably one of my favorite thinkers when it comes to the intersection between law and crypto. And so I had her on to talk about some of the more recent research that she's been working on that we'll go into more detail in a bit. So hi, Primavera, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
So to start off, I was really interested because you've been in the crypto space for quite a while and quite early compared to a lot of people. And so I just was wondering if you could maybe explain a bit like what got you first into to start studying crypto as a research topic.
Yeah, I mean, I've been studying as a legal scholar. I've been studying all the questions surrounding the challenges of emerging digital technologies initially on copyright, and then this brought me into peer-to-peer file sharing and decentralized architecture, and then I kind of switched my focus on the legal challenges and opportunities actually raised by decentralized online architectures and the governance that emerged out of that. And so in some way it was quite a natural shift to also look at blockchain technologies. And I think it's when Ethereum came out, because I mean I've been looking at like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, but more as an example, as one out of many. And when Ethereum came out, I think I realized that there are so many exciting legal challenges, and that I don't really need to look at anything else. That's enough. And so I decided to focus pretty much 100% of my research on those questions.
Yeah, from what I understand, you were definitely involved in kind of like the very early attempts at creating DAOs with DAO Stack.
At the time, it was called Backfeed.
Okay, I didn't know the name.
So it was not DAO Stack. It was, but it was with Matan, which is we've been like since 2015. We were trying to develop decentralized architecture for distributed reputation and distributed value repartition. And yeah, the idea was to create this kind of a platform enabling DAOs to very easily deploy using those building blocks for reputation and economic models for the tokens and so forth. Those are extremely fun and exciting times. But I think it was a time in which when you were saying DAO, no one had any idea what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was fun.
So you were quite early in that, like, I guess what ended up becoming DAOs today. But I guess for you at this point, looking back, do you think did the crypto world sort of evolve and change according to your expectations of what you thought in the beginning when you were first exploring the idea of DAOs?
I mean, actually, I think it took maybe longer than I was expecting, but I actually think we are now entering a point in which, yeah, this is like the point in which we are now, where there is really this effervescence of many different DAOs emerging, and I think we're still in the exploratory phase of how do we design them, how do we govern them, etc. So in fact, now more than ever, I keep hearing people, mostly DAO, like DAO founders or DAO contributors, how much something like Backfeed is needed. So we were just like 7 years too early on trying to provide a solution for a problem that didn't exist yet. But now, like this distributed reputation system is and value distribution. This is actually what most DAOs really are exploring at the moment. So in some ways, like maybe now we need to start Backfeed again.
If I understand correctly, Backfeed is something that is kind of like provided like templates for DAOs or kind of like standards for creation of a DAO, or
Yeah, more
is that
than
not right?
standards. I think the idea was really like kind of like what Aragon and DAO Stack are doing. It was like to create a platform or an infrastructure with modular items, so that I want to create a DAO, I create my DAO, but then I'm not sure how to design the reputation system. I'm not sure how to design the governance or the token economics. And there is modules that I can implement, that I can adopt, or that I can tweak. But basically, it's like having like a kind of like you want to make a website, and then you have like WordPress, and you have a lot of plugins that you put together. So kind of like this, like kind of plugins for governance, reputation, and value distribution.
Right. So not just necessarily like deploying a smart contract, but like having a visual representation or a dashboard in a way that's like readable.
Yeah, I mean,
to manage it.
Yes, eventually that's great too, but it's more than the front end. It was the back end that it was like the actual protocols for distributed reputation and for distributed value repartition.
Right. To like kind of be able to, I imagine, like modulate or edit certain values that you would want specifically created for your DAO.
Basically, is how do you create a Sybil resilient system where when you have people contributing to a DAO, you want to be able to evaluate what is that contribution, how much value are you bringing, and according to the value that you bring, you're going to be assigned, and this has to be a collective decision, you're going to be assigned some economic token rewards and some reputation. And then you have a system by which the more you contribute, the more influence you have in order to evaluate the contribution of others. But only so far as the contribution is aligned with the interest of the DAO. And so the challenge, of course, is how do you make it such that it is Sybil resilient, and how do you make it such that it doesn't generate oligopolistic tendency and so forth. So it's actually a quite a challenging exercise in a pseudonymous ecosystem.
Yeah. One of the things that like I think is that I remember when I was like first starting out looking into I mean specifically it was Ethereum. Like I remember looking at things like Aragon and all this stuff with DAOs and kind of like thinking how different it was than sort of the way that crypto was being portrayed at the time as being a type of kind of solely individually minded or like solely libertarian like esque type of endeavor, whereas this sort of like very interesting niche and like avant-garde type of space it felt was way more way more minded about the collective, I guess, which kind of goes against what a lot of people were saying at the time.
Yeah, I mean, depends who you're hanging out with, I think.
yeah, indeed. So when it comes to law, I was curious to know if you had any thoughts on what were some of the, I guess for you, what are some of the biggest questions that are related to law that you think people haven't yet been talking about too much that you think will become bigger issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are really starting to talk about it, but somehow we don't really have a proper legal response. And I think it's given the fact that finally we are actually experiencing some. Um, I don't dare to call it a Cambrian explosion because we're not there yet, but some kind of like deployment of a decent number of DAO, and also the DAOification of a lot of things that were created as non-DAOs and now wants to become DAOs. And then, of course, that's fantastic. And there is some challenges in like, okay, how do we exit to community? How do we DAOify and so forth? But then there is like the most fundamental challenge, perhaps, which is how do those new type of entities, which are DAOs, can interface with the rest of the world, which is a non-blockchain system. And so all those questions, first and foremost, because I think this is really a question that needs to be tackled as soon as possible, is the question of, well, what is the given given the standard state of the law, what is the way in which DAOs are recognized? Are there general partnership? And therefore, what type of liability can be imposed on the various DAO members? What happened to the people that are voting versus non-voting? Like all this question about like who can be held liable for what, if there is something that the DAO has done that is maybe not perfectly in line with what the law is expecting, and yet those things are fairly invisible. Like, so it's hard to even it's hard for the DAO to interface with existing legal entity. It's hard for the DAO to actually contract or hire people. It's hard for the DAO to pay taxes, etc. So all those interactions that are very standard for a company or an organization, but that DAOs are doing pretty much in the same way, but from a legal perspective, they cannot do it. And so all those, all those gateways, like how do we help the DAO actually provide a real contract to its contractors, or provide like hire people in a way that they're actually hired, and so we start seeing not like solutions which are partial solution, in the sense that we now we have like those organizations that are incorporated as organization in order to enable the DAO to in order to provide a gateway for DAO to then interact. But we don't yet have the proper answer concerning the DAO itself. And so we've been doing, of course, with Koala and with my research project, we've been doing a lot of work concerning like the DAO model law, for instance, providing suggestion for policymaker, etc. How could that look like? A world in which the law does provide some type of legal recognition for certain types of DAO, because obviously not any DAO might actually be eligible. And what are the conditions for DAO members to benefit from some type of partial limited liability and so forth. So essentially, like all the question about how do we help DAOs be actual actors in society and not just being actors into this membrane that is the blockchain-based ecosystem, but how do we create bridges between the legal entity and people that have some legal requirement when they are doing something, and a DAO.
Right. Yeah. Do you think? I can imagine some people saying like taking sort of like the other extreme position where DAOs should be, and the crypto world should be sort of an alternative to the current existing world, and actually being creating a legal entity is in some way a co-optation or being subsumed into a system that crypto was meant to subvert or to like replace in some way.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends how you're talking about it. Like asking a DAO to incorporate as a legal entity is pretty much creating a legal entity, and then you have a DAO and you have a legal entity. The two are not the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, yeah, you're just abiding by what the legal system asks you to do. That's very different from saying that we are trying to create interfaces between the two, because if your goal is to create an alternative, there is very little alternative that will be viable if it cannot interface with existing legal structures, right? Otherwise, you're confined into that small world, which is the blockchain only world. And as good as your alternative it is, it's not going to be very mainstream. So creating those interfaces, and when I'm talking about interfaces, I'm not talking about just submitting to the legacy system by just incorporating. I'm talking about enabling DAOs to exist within their own alternative framework and having ways to pierce into the legal world through those bridges, which they can choose to use when they need, but they also don't have to go all the way on the other side.
Right. It seems to me that it's a potentially necessary step if you want to move beyond kind of being it being kind of like a local little project that you do with your friends that's kind of breaks apart maybe in like certain amounts of stress. Or if you want, in order to become mainstream, you just kind of have to deal with the realities.
I mean, it's just that personally, I just don't believe into this distinction between the blockchain world and the rest of the world.
Right.
I think the reality is a hybrid, and the more we manage to create bridges from one side to the other, then the more interesting it gets.
Yeah, alright, you gave me that magic, yeah.
And so, like, I think this would be a great transition into the thing that we really want to talk about, which is your work and what you've called Extitutional Theory, which I think maybe perhaps explains kind of some of these interactions that you're talking about. But maybe to start off, could you explain what extitutional theory is and how does that relate to or differ from like thinking about institutions?
Yeah, so I think I should be able to pitch it in a few minutes by now. Basically, yeah, extitutional theory is like something that very important theory that emerged a few years ago, and by a little crazy group of extitutional scholars, and we've been gathering nonstop for like few months that then became few years, just like trying to come up with actually a whole new field of scholarship, which is extitutional theory. And the motivation is that today we understand very well institutions. We have a lot of literature, a lot of insights about how do we create and how do we manage and how do we engage into the process of institutionalization. And that's very useful. But that's also only one phase of why and how are people interacting with each other and coordinating themselves. And so there are other phases, there are other ways that explain and that inform the interaction of people. And those are not always institutional. And the problem is that while we are all aware that institution is not everything, we also don't have a name for the other thing. And so extitutional theory is kind of trying to take an ontological approach into creating a new terminology, a new vocabulary, a new conceptual and theoretical framework in order to organize all those thoughts around alternative ways of ordering social dynamics. And the main distinction is that while the institutional framework is looking at and actually only seeing things that relate to roles and rules associated with those roles. And so when you look at a social group, you describe the interaction and you analyze those interaction based on what are the roles of the various people in the group and what are the rules that have been instituted into that group. And of course, that's both a descriptive and a performative function, because the fact that you have institutionalized will affect the behavior of people as well. On the other hand, what we call extitutional dynamics are all those things that are not based on the roles and the rules, but are based on the actual identities of people. And by identity, I mean the way in which one person identifies themselves and how this person is identified by others. And the relationship that exists between those different identities. And this is just as fundamental, in fact, as the institutional dynamics, and actually acquiring the extitutional lens in order to observe, analyze, describe the behavior of people has both an explanatory function, but also, just like the institutional framework, also a performative function, because the moment in which you start looking at and describing and analyzing things in an extitutional way, it also will inform the behavior of people that have become aware of those extitutional dynamics. And so the idea is that we want to disentangle the institutional dynamics and the extitutional dynamics within a particular social group. And by doing so, we can also better analyze the interplay between institutions and extitutions. And then we can start understanding better how can we design good institutions that are collaborating with the extitutions that it is intended to support, because we do create institutional scaffoldings, usually with the goal of helping a particular social group and the extitutional dynamics within that social group be more healthy or be more effective. And the problem is that if we don't look at the consequences that a particular institutional contraption has on the extitutional dynamics, then we might end up trying to solve a problem, and by doing so, generating a new problem, because all of a sudden we're stepping on the toes of the extitution, we're like suffocating it, we're undermining it, and so we're weakening those extitutional dynamics, which were positive, because we are trying to control the extitutional dynamics that were negative. And so by shedding light through this new vocabulary, through this new ontological and conceptual framework, by shedding light on the extitutional dynamics, then we can better understand how the institutionalization impact the extitution and how the extitutionalization impact the institution, and what does it even mean to extitutionalize as opposed to institutionalize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like the way I understand it, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you can think of the institution or like the institutional framework as thinking about what is like the official rules or the official what the legal documents say about the institution and how your relationships are. So you may have like the CEO and then the secretary and then the sort of hierarchy within a company as one example, or even the hierarchy within a government institution. And that's one way to describe this social group or organization, but that framework doesn't describe everything that is happening within that institution. There are things that sort of reside outside of what is being defined by the institution, that if you only look at it from an institutional point of view, maybe you will miss out on the fact that, I don't know, for some reason it's important that everybody likes to hang around the water cooler at a particular time and place. And maybe that has effects on how later on the institution sort of portrays itself, or that it changes a rule because of one reason or another. And so like these different exitutional dynamics within the social group can create perhaps changes within the institution in one direction, or vice versa. The institution can impose a rule which changes the extitutional dynamics that are happening within that social group.
Right, and usually we have we look at like the organigram, right? Like you look at the roles and the rules. You have your little structure, but this usually doesn't reflect much more than those rules. But then there is like all the individual relationship and the way in which people interact, the reason that they interact, the power that they have on each other is not. You cannot just look at the institutional framework to explain that. Mm-hmm. There are so many other forces at play that that are invisible to the institutional structure and that are part of the extitutional fabric. The fact that I am the best friend with a very powerful person might actually give me more leeway in the organization than if I had a more powerful role, right? So all those extitutional dynamics cannot be ignored if you want to actually, from a descriptive perspective, understand where everyone stands. They need to be accounted for when you design, if you have an objective as to this is how I think the social group should work, then you cannot just create rules and roles. You also need to understand the extitutional dynamics and try to tackle those as well. Mm-hmm. Because extitutional dynamics can be very powerful and very positive, but they can also be very negative, like nepotism or corruption and all these things.
Right, yeah. It's... Sorry, I think every time you get a notification, I hear the bing. Sorry. Yes, so I'm just imagining that I've been thinking of just kind of like a kingdom or something like that. You have those examples of where someone becomes a king and maybe they're too young to be a king, or they're actually a very inept, socially inept person who is on the throne institutionally within the monarchy, but then you have all their advisors who are maybe the ones who are actually controlling the show, or kind of using him as a puppet, and that maybe those are kind of the exitutional dynamics.
Yeah, that's an example.
Yeah. So another sort of aspect, a part of institutional versus exitutional frameworks, is this idea of enclosure versus exclosure, which I think is a pretty interesting idea. So from what I understand, you can think of institutions as being a place where they enclose particular social dynamics, where under extitutional theory, you can sort of think of exclosures, or places where you're not necessarily enclosing what the social dynamics are, but creating a place of maybe particular types of freedoms within the institution. Do you want to Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit? I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so basically an institution encloses in the sense that within the domain of the institution, you are subject to the rules and the roles of the institution. And so it is a space in which the behavior of people is constrained by those rules and by those roles. So sometimes, and sometimes it's done for a good reason because you actually want people to follow those rules and those roles. But in certain cases, this might be too draconian. Some extitutional dynamics which cannot express themselves anymore given those rules and those roles because it's too constraining for them, might want to escape from some of those constraints. But the problem is that either you escape by escaping the institution, if you can, because it's not always possible to escape the institution without losing all the benefits of being part of that institution. And so an alternative way, if you want to stay within the institution, but you want to acquire a little bit more freedom of action, then comes the notion of exclosure. So in I guess in English, an enclosure is a fence, and an exclosure is when you create a fence within the fence. So usually it's used as the example with browsing animals. So you create a fence in order to make sure that the sheep do not run away when they graze. But then there is a particular part of that territory where you really don't want the sheep to come to graze to eat the grass. And so you're going to create another fence inside the fence that is protecting the territory against the sheep, right? So that's the notion of an exclosure. Now, in extitutional theory, we took again the word to mean something slightly different, which is, so you have the fence, which is the institutional set of roles and rules, and then you want to exclose away from some of those rules. And so you're going to create a fence, and the fence has to be of the same type as the institutional fence. So if the rules and the roles have been defined through legal means, then the exclosure has to speak the language of the law in order to be able to create something that is protecting the inside of that field, and also that the institution has no way of stepping in, because if the institution were to even try to step in, it will have to violate its own rules. And so that's the magic trick of the exclosure, is that because you use exactly the same language, the same codes that the institution has constituted in order to create a fence against those codes, then you become untouchable by the institution. An example, which I think is a very nice and clear example, is copyright and copyleft. So copyright is an enclosure of the public domain. It's an enclosure of things that usually are not subject to any constraint, right? Like you have creation, you have creative content. All of a sudden, the law comes in and enclose some part of the territory of creative expression, and stipulate that now all those things that sit within the territory of copyright law are subject to specific rules, which is, well, now you can no longer reproduce without authorization, you cannot remix it, etc. And that's what society has decided is good for creativity. But then you might have some people or some artistic practices that don't love it, and that actually feel that they will benefit more from having more ability to have people reproduce, remix their works. And so because copyright is a legal tool, copyright is is designed to enable people to do copyright licenses in order to give some, in order to license some of those restrictions to some people. And so all of a sudden, if you use the same tool, which is a contractual copyright license, but instead of using it as intended by copyright in order to constrain and in order to monetize, you use it in order to actually carve out a space of freedom in which all of a sudden within that space now everyone can do again the things that copyright has prevented them from doing, which is reproduction, distribution, remix, and so forth. Then that contractual license is excluding those artistic creation out of the enclosed territory of copyright law. And copyright law cannot do anything but respect that, because it's speaking exactly the language of the law. And it's, if you don't respect a copyleft license, it means that you don't respect a copyright license. And it means that the system does not respect its own codes. Right? So that's a good example, because I think we are all very acquainted with that, and it explains very clearly why it's so important that the exclosure be made of the exact same fabric as the enclosure.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way of kind of just pitting the system against itself for your own kind of like creating at least your own spaces of freedom, or in certain respects it could be seen as freedom. Yeah, I was thinking, because I mean we've been talking about this a little bit before, but yeah, it's very much kind of like, you can think of it, if you're into Deleuze, of course, like deterritorializing a very territorialized space within an institution, as a way to kind of create new spaces for more or different, at least, ways of interaction and social relationships, and the copyleft stuff is a good example of that. Hi everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the interview or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out. It really helps, since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus content like Q&A episodes. You can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in 20-30 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I reviewed one of Vitalik's latest papers he co-authored detailing his vision for decentralized society and use cases for soul-bound tokens. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. And so with the executional framework, I think for me, what I think is really interesting is that it seems like a very helpful way in recognizing kind of lower level interactions that happen within an institution that could ultimately, in one direction, it could bring change within it. And I feel like this is perhaps a really interesting framework for understanding like how collective action can be or could be organized. Is that kind of like a correct way of understanding it?
Yeah, I mean, both institutions, institutional framework and extitutional frameworks are pretty much intended to guide and manage and support collective action. It's ways by which people interact and organize. And the thing is that because we lack the ontological and conceptual framework of extitution today, when we're thinking about managing collective action, we oftentimes default into the realm of institutions because that's what we know, because that's what we've been taught. But intuitively and naturally, of course, we also do it in an extitutional manner. But because we lack the vocabulary, it's even hard to speak about it. it's hard to think about it because of the lack of a common ontological framework. And while many disciplines, of course, have came up with various ways of talking or identifying those exstitutional dynamics, there is no common unified language to talk about that. And that means that we have a tendency to lean more towards the institutionalization than toward the extitutionalization, simply not because of a preference, but simply because that's what we are thinking of and that's what we can talk of. And so the introduction of a vocabulary, while very simple, and I think that's the power, is the simplicity, because actually once you talk and once you introduce the notion of exstitution to people, everyone understands what we're talking about because everyone has engaged and everyone has been subject to those exstitutional dynamics. It's just that they never explicitly thought about it because of the lack of a word, because of the lack of a vocabulary. So in some way, while it is very important to have like a whole theoretical framework that really try to establish a better understanding of those dynamics, everyone understands it in some way intuitively. And so somehow just adding the word into, just throwing this word into the wild is already in and of itself a fantastic contribution to help people have a better grasp and be able to think and discuss and exchange about those things that they have been doing all the time, but that they could never talk about.
Yeah.
Not in an easy way.
Could you explain a bit what you mean by extitutionalization?
Yeah, exactly. So this is the big field of research that we have, which is when we all know what institutionalization means. It means creating more rules and creating more roles, and reinforcing the institutional structure. So what is the institutional correspondence of that? Well, it is actually about affecting and reinforcing or building or actually weakening, if needed, some relationships, the nature, the quality, the intensity of specific relationships between specific identities, right? And so again, as a analogy or metaphor, we can think of institutions as boxes where you throw people into the box, and those are the members of the institution. And then the box is structured with various little boxes, which are the holes, and then that stipulates the relationship between those boxes. Now, when you move into an extitutional framework, there are no boxes. There is no concept of membership, non-membership. So you cannot rely on the same tools, right? And the exstitution, they operate via gravitational forces, right? So you have some people that have more or less weight within the exstitution, and the more weight you have, and the more connections you have, the more relationships, then the more gravitational force you also have, and the more influence you have, right? And so it's a very different game. You cannot just carve out a new box or create a new rule. You really have to it's a much more imprecise science, where you really have to look into those gravitational force, those weights. You have to look at this rhizomatic interconnection of people and try to play into that. So the role of the process of extitutionalization is creating this rhizome, and then changing, modifying the weights and the gravitational forces that exist amongst those different actors, and trying to find the perfect constellation of people and relationships and identities that lead to that particular type and quality of collective actions that you're trying to achieve. And usually, in the same way as like just playing on the institutionalization will never lead to the intended behavior, just playing with the extitutionalization also will never lead to the intended behavior. And what you need is this proper combo, this delicate balance, this equilibrium between some degree of institutional structure and some well-crafted extitutional fabric, which when interacting with one another will actually lead to that particular type of organization, collective action that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Like one of the things that, of course, come to mind for me, and that I think for the audience might be interesting, is kind of the creation of labor unions. So like starting off as kind of like this extitutional dynamic where you and your coworkers have kind of decided that you're not being paid very well, you don't have very nice working conditions, and so over time, sort of extitutionally creating the relationships and the dynamics that would later create the collective action that would be needed into perhaps institutionalizing maybe like the labor union into the company. And becoming and creating change in that direction. That doesn't mean that like extitutional dynamics are then gone, but that you sort of institutionalized perhaps what were some of the already existing extitutional dynamics that were happening in the creation of a labor union.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that you're institutionalizing those dynamics. I will say more that a particular set of extitutional dynamics which express dissatisfaction with the current institutional rule set are demanding for an upgrade of those institutional rule sets in order to fulfill their demands.
Okay. And so in relationship to getting back to DAOs now, you mentioned in a piece that network technologies in particular have created dramatic new exclosures, giving rise to extitutional dynamics, which can't be understood through the institutional lens alone. So if we apply like this framework to network technologies like blockchains and like DAOs, what do you think makes them special in giving rise to extitutional dynamics?
Yeah, so I mean, blockchain-based systems are actually a fascinating ecosystem and laboratory of exploration for institutional and extitutional dynamics, because in some way they are. So like what we really like to do as our little group of extitutional scholars is to try to find those social groups, organizations, which express a strong degree of extitutional dynamics and a strong degree of institutional ones. So because those are like where you can really look at the interplay. And the interesting thing about blockchains is that they are very extreme on both ends. Because on the one hand, you have this hyper-codification of everything, which is very institutional in the sense of it is very strongly correlated with setting up rules and roles and codifying those into a protocol. So there's a very high degree of institutionality into that. But at the same time, there is a extreme and radical amount of extitutional dynamics, because everything that happens in between, the deliberation, the actual decision making that happens before the vote is being casted, basically everything that is off-chain governance is extremely extitutional, because there are very few rules and rules about that, because all the institution has been put into the on-chain infrastructure. And so it becomes extremely interesting to look at this interplay between on-chain, off-chain, and therefore between institutional and extitutional dynamics. And so the only way you can actually understand the governance of a blockchain system, of a DAO, etc., you cannot just look at the protocol and be like, okay, I got it. That's exactly how it works. Not at all. Right. The protocol is only the institutional aspect of things, but you will never understand how the system works if you don't also look at all the off-chain dynamics and the extitutionality of it.
Right.
And what is really interesting is also looking at how some systems try, for the best or the worst, and with different success factors, in integrating them to some extent, right? Like in understanding that interplay, like how do the extitutional dynamics affect? So how does off-chain governance affect on-chain governance? And how does on-chain governance can account for or affect in return the off-chain extitutional dynamics, right? So in some way, it's one of the best field on which to apply extitutional theory, and that's also one of the fields that perhaps needs it the most.
Yeah.
Because we cannot just rely on our understanding of traditional institutional frameworks to understand and to design a proper blockchain governance structure.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting because, first off, in blockchain world and DAOs, like it's very easy, I think, to think of sort of DAOs or things that happen on the blockchain as purely things that are on chain or purely like things that are in your smart contract, which I think is a huge mistake that I see in a lot of critics of blockchains or DAOs, is that they will want to say that, all like DAOs are bad because it's just the sort of like, we're just putting, it's the, like algocracy, or like it's, everything is becoming deterministic and there's no wiggle room for anything, and that everything becomes solidified. And in some instances, that is the case. And in some respects, that is true. But also at the same time, that sort of ignores like what is actually happening within those organizations that don't fit exactly maybe what their smart contracts imply, if that makes sense. So like that's, I think there is this impression that everything is just like financialized and everything is sort of based on just kind of like incentives. But from like actually being in a DAO, a lot of it relies on kind of off-chain trust and not just, trust in smart contracts.
Absolutely. And I think, to be fair, most people have figured that out by now. Like, I think that illusion of a completely automated and trustless system is no longer the mainstream view. But indeed, now that this understanding has came about, it becomes more and more important to also understand. So, what are those tools by which we can craft and support those extitutional dynamics without having to constantly institutionalize them into either on-chain or with more like traditional types of institutional structures that still rely on roles and rules, but really like And also because this is somehow also part of the, this is part of the, at least the vision of quite a few DAOs, which the reason that they choose to, that a community choose to deploy itself through a DAO is because they actually don't want those traditional roles and rules that are found in existing or traditional institutions. They actually are trying to have a much more flexible, malleable thing in which it's more about participation. It's not about like, I don't have a rule because I'm a DAO member. I'm just participating to the DAO, and I can participate in any ways. And then it's the DAO that indeed needs to recognize, well, what's the value I've been providing in a very extitutional settings. And so in some way, like, understanding this interplay between institution and execution can enable us to create those DAOs where the on-chain governance structure is a very healthy scaffolding, but it is a scaffolding and nothing more. It is not the endpoint. The endpoint is always and inherently the vibrancy of the people that are contributing, that are interacting via this DAO. And you don't want to codify everything on-chain, of course not. You want to use the on-chain infrastructure as this scaffolding that is supporting, that is enabling specific type of interaction, which are inherently off-chain interaction. That's where the collective lives, right? And maybe when we move into like hyper financialized DeFi infrastructure, we can afford having more on-chain things because in those cases, the execution is less important. But when you move into those DAOs, which actually have a more social and institutional vision, then you actually want to maintain as much as possible of this extitutionality that is off-chain, and just find those anchor points that are the on-chain governance in order to help this collective action happen. But the collective action is only using a small layer of on-chain infrastructure in order to help them, in order to enable to do things that they couldn't do without this infrastructure. But in fact, the goal is like, how do we create the minimal amount of on-chain governance structure that will enable the maximum amount of executional dynamics around the DAO?
Yeah, this is like, or I like how this is just like a completely different vision than also as well the first sort of musings about DAOs were, of course, DACs, and kind of thinking about using blockchains or smart contracts as a way to create the like ultimately automated company. But sort of, I think what it shows is that a lot of these people who sort of thought like this, especially in the beginning, I think, they were thinking too institutionally. Basically, I think that the reason why people are interested in DAOs are for kind of like different reasons than why the original creators sort of wanted to create them, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know who is the original creator. I think it's more like that terminology has... No, what I mean is that I don't think the terminology existed before the creation. Yeah. And in fact, now I think the vocabulary of DAO has completely changed meaning, because now more and more people are referring to DAO as collectives, independently of whether they use a blockchain or not. Yeah. Right? So this autonomous word has all of a sudden evolved into a very different meaning. I mean, I don't know what's the right way to see it, but to me, my understanding today is that DAOs are actually anything that is completely automated. You call it a smart contract. And whenever you actually want, whenever it's a desirable feature to have human governance, then you call it a DAO.
Yeah, already it came with that magic, yeah.
Right, yeah. Do you think that's because I think what also I see a lot of the time is people have been thinking about smart contracts as purely a tool for creating new institutions, or like it's a new tool for the development of new kinds of institutions. But what I gather here, kind of what the exitutional theory brings is maybe thinking about not that smart contracts only bring about creation of new institutions, but also thinking about how those smart contracts could bring about new exitutional dynamics.
Yes, and the two always comes with one another, right? You cannot have an institution without the execution that comes with it, and vice versa. So there is no such thing as one institution and one execution. It's always you have a social group, and then you can look at this social group via the lens of institutions, and then you see institutional dynamics, or you look at the exact same social group via the lens of executions, and then you will see the executional dynamics. And so indeed, a blockchain enables new types of social organizations, which therefore implies new typologies potentially of both institutional and executional dynamics.
And so we've gone about the hour, and I wanted to ask just one last question because you are a legal scholar, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. But do you think code is law?
Yeah,
it's a can of worms.
It's yeah. This is contextual. It depends what you mean by law, first of all. I'm saying this because this sentence has been used and abused in so many contexts to say different things. So if I say yes, it might be used in a different context where I will say no. I do think the original meaning of Lawrence Lessig that used this expression is not that code is law. Is that, I mean, it said the word, but the meaning was that code can be used to fulfill similar functions as law, right? Which is regulating behavior. So in that case, of course, code is a very powerful tool to regulate behaviors. It's a really powerful tool to create rules and roles, which is what law is also a very powerful tool for. Although they do have very different dynamics, and that's where the analogy does no longer stand. Code is not like law. It has the same function, or it can be used as affecting the same objectives, but code is not law because the nature of those two things is completely different. Code creates ex ante constraints on what you can or cannot do. Law just creates institutional rules, which then you have to choose whether you're going to respect or not. And then some judicial system will choose whether or not to sanction you. So those are very different things. And saying that code is law without acknowledging the difference in nature of those two types of rules, I think is also very problematic, right? You cannot just assimilate them. So code has the same, code can be used to have similar functionalities as law, but it does not operate according to the same prerogative, and therefore, in that sense, it is not law.
No, I think it's really interesting to see how that word has been kind of used and abused in particular instances, and how I think it's definitely shifted since the beginning. I remember the phrase "code is law" was used quite a lot in the beginning, especially in regards to like the DAO hack and things like this. You had the one camp that said code is law, and therefore you should respect the fact that this guy, didn't break any of the law, or he didn't break any of the code in order to steal or take a bunch of cryptocurrency. But then, despite that fact, still people chose to revert the Ethereum blockchain in order to reverse kind of what occurred at that moment. And to me, that was kind of like a show of that in some respects, code can be has a lot of the same properties, like you said, but ultimately it is humans that kind of like direct these systems and ultimately choose whether or not, or choose how to respond to maybe instances where code is used in a way that is unintended. And I think one of the examples that I've heard you give before was kind of thinking of like MEV as being a type of, I guess you use that as an example of Exclosure the other day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a place in which you're not violating any rules. In fact, you're talking the language of the protocol in order to achieve something that actually was not envisioned by the protocol. And yet, the protocol cannot do anything against you. And so it's a form of exclosure to actually acquire additional spaces of freedom in a way that some people consider to be not necessarily legitimate. Some people consider to be completely legitimate, just like, is copyleft illegitimate? Of course not. It's just a system that uses copyright in order to escape from the constraint of copyright. And so in some way, you can see MEV as a system that actually relies on the rules of the protocol in order to actually achieve things that somehow the protocol had not envisioned.
So do you think that then, like, the moments in which hackers maybe take or like steal cryptocurrency out of smart contracts through DeFi, through the protocol, those are kind of instances of negative exclosure?
I mean, in that sense, I wouldn't call it an exclosure, because this is just like, it's just like you find you're not really creating a fence. You're just finding a hole in the fence, right?
But in the case of MEV, because it's sort of continuously there,
because MEV is actually becoming its own domain. So it's like it has created its own exclosed domain in which people that want to engage in particular practices enter into the MEV domain.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and explaining exitutional theory to us. I know it's something that, for me, we've been talking about it a little bit the past couple of days, and I still have to, spend some time to maybe wrap my head around it completely. But yeah, thanks a lot. And maybe just to finish off, if you want to share with people where they can keep up with you and your work.
So there is like the blockchain gov, blockchaingov.eu, which is where we try to gather all the work we're doing as part of my European research project. There is koala.global, which is more of like the work I'm doing as part of this kind of like international network of researchers and lawyers, mostly trying to identify how we can bridge DAOs and more generally blockchain-based systems with the legal system. And then just more generally, you can just Google my name and you might find a lot of more or less interesting pieces of writing.
Yes, definitely. People will find it. All right. Thanks so much.
Good. Thanks a lot.